Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. And you know this old girl, right? This is my 1950 Farmall MD. Starts on gasoline, switches over to diesel once it warms up. If you follow the series, I've rebuilt this tractor front to back, every nut and bolt, had everything apart, ran it for about 20 hours, and it dropped a valve. And it turned out when I pulled the engine apart that the head gasket had blown in several places. So I took the head to a very good machine shop, and I went this morning and picked it up. It's all ready to put back together now. I think I should have all the parts and gaskets and whatnot that I need. Here's the head. This is the valve that dropped, number 2 intake valve. Here's the underside of the head where it mates to the block. And again, this is the valve that dropped right here, number 2 intake. David Richards is the machinist that did the work for me. He has his own YouTube channel, does very meticulous work. He put in a new set of valve guides that I got from Bates Corporation. He put in a new valve for the one that had dropped. He ground the valves and seats, all of them, and planed the bottom surface of the head. Even though the previous machine shop said that they had planed the head, he found that the head wasn't true. He showed me a photo where he'd taken off 5/1000ths and it had, shined up the head here, but it hadn't touched here. So he went through, and I feel he did it the right way. He also put a slightly different finish than was on the head before. You can just feel with your fingernail some texture there. And he said that that helps the head gasket stay seated better than the smoother finish that was on it. While David was busy with the head, I spent some time checking out the rest of the engine. I took the time to pull the oil pan and pull the number 2 piston out to check it out. The first thing I did before I pulled it was I measured its relative position to the other piston that is its mate, and that way you can tell whether the connecting rod bent at all. The connecting rod was fine. Both piston tops measured at the same distance to the top of the liner here. After I dropped the pan, I pulled the piston and the connecting rod out, checked the piston out, measured the piston, looked for any visible damage, checked the rings, make sure that they were all fine. Everything was just fine. These pistons are built like tank. They aren't like little car pistons with skirts that are this long. These pistons are 6 inches long, and they probably got that much aluminum on the top of them. So being bulletproof has its advantages. In addition, I took a look at the deck on the block here, measured it as best I can for flatness, measured the piston liner protrusion, which is about 4/1000ths what it should be. If you saw the original series on the engine, these sleeves or liners come in 2 varieties, and they have mating head gaskets for depending on which variety you choose. Original factory sleeves had a standout in the 20,000ths, so they stood proud of the block deck quite a bit. And then the fire ring on the head gasket was outside of the edge of the liner. That's one option. The option I went with, because aftermarket parts are mostly this these days, is a standard protrusion on the sleeve of about 4/1000ths with a head gasket fire ring that seats on the top of the sleeve and makes the seal there. I cleaned all the residue from the old head gasket off of here. I went over it with a Scotch-Brite pad and lacquer thinner. Got this just as clean as I could. Got all of the carbon off it. What you see on here is just staining. You can't feel any of it with your finger. It's all nice and bright metal now. While I had the number 2 piston out, I cleaned up the sharp edges of the impression that the valve made on the top of the piston. This is the new head gasket, and for those who didn't see it, when I first did this tractor a year and a half ago, I went into great detail on how the head gasket and the head went on. I'm doing it the same way, except I'm not using copper coat this time, the spray sealant. I put 3 very light coats on the gasket last time. I've since learned that the manufacturer of this gasket says you should not use sealant on this gasket and believes that's why it blew out. So this time, no sealant, but everything is, you could eat off of it. I cleaned and cleaned to get this just as clean as can be, and the idea is that the material in the gasket actually forms a seal all by itself. No extra sealer is needed. Different from the older metal clad gaskets that I'm accustomed to putting on the other tractors I've restored. Next I'm going to get this head into position. I cleaned the underside of it with lacquer thinner, got that all spotless and grease free as well, or oil free. And we're going to start to get it into place here. Before I lower this all the way, I want to make sure that my head gasket is still where I want it to be and all flat and straight. Next we can get the head nuts started on these studs, and I brush them down with just a little bit of motor oil so that I ensure that I have an even torque when I go to torque them down. I didn't worry about chasing the threads on these this time around because I had just done it when I rebuilt the engine, and I know that they all move smoothly from when I took the head nuts off. Put these on. All the head nuts are on now, finger tight. In case anybody was wondering, there's 18 of them in here. There's two sources for torque on these head nuts. One is the original International Blue Ribbon service manual for this tractor, which says 110 foot-pounds torque. And then there's the INT value, which is 110 to 135. So I think I'm going to tighten them to 120, and I'm going to do that in 3 steps. First I'm going to tighten them to 40, then 80, then 120. And when you tighten head nuts, you always work in a spiral. So you start in the center, and then you kind of spiral outward, working both from the center out to both sides and from the center out to both ends. There's no order given for the tightening in the manual. That's not uncommon for old engines, so that's kind of the default way you do it if no value or no chart is given. I've gone through the 40 and the 80 foot-pound step, and now I'm bringing them to full torque, 120 foot-pounds. Starting from the center again and working out. I got my secret weapon going, the fan. I've been through them all at 120, and now I'm going to go back over them because inevitably some of them need more tightening. Especially the ones you started at in the center. Now you can put the injectors in. There's a dust shield O-ring here that just needs to be seated properly. I oiled it up a little bit to get it to go in smoothly. Well, come on, you. There we go. And number 4. This is the coolant outlet for the head that connects the head to the radiator and also contains the thermostat. I always use a little Permatex Right Stuff on these old pitted castings so I can get a good seal at the hoses. But I've been through all this before with you guys, so you know the drill. Next we'll take care of the rocker arm assembly. The first thing that goes on these caps that go on the 3rd valve, which opens the decompression chamber to the spark plugs. Oh, put that one in there. Then we got to get all these studs put in the right spots. There's 3 different lengths. Long ones go in here. Medium ones go here and here. And shorties go in the front. We'll tighten these down with my handy stud tool here. Push rods. Rocker arm assembly goes on, and it's a little bit difficult because it's got this rod under here which actuates the decompression valves, and that all has to fit together properly. It's day 2, the morning of. Last night I got started late, so I got as much done as I could. First thing is to adjust the valve tappet gap here. 0.017 hot, which is room temperature really. Go through and adjust them all. They've all changed quite a bit with the head work being done. You know how this goes. I've explained it a couple times. On these old Farmall 4-cylinders, they're all pretty much the same. you can get away with adjusting all the valves by just one rotation of the engine. So first you bring number 1 to top dead center of compression. You can do 1, 2, 3, and 5 on that setting. Then rotate the engine 360 degrees, and that brings in the rest of the valves. Number 4, number 6, number 7, number 8. There's a million ways to do this, I guess. I never do it the same way twice, it seems like. The thing that's a bit discouraging about doing this is I'm going to have to do it all over again after I start the engine and run it for a while, because I'm going to have to pull everything back apart to retorque the head nuts and put it all back together and readjust it. Tons of fun. Now then, I just want to roll this over in gasoline mode to, you know, make sure nothing goes kerflooey. Looks good. Next comes the exhaust manifold gaskets. Oh my gosh, these are new old stock. Wow. And the exhaust manifold. Now, since the head was off, I have to adjust all this mess. All this linkage in here controls the changeover to diesel. And the first thing I got to do is adjust the length of this yoke here so that these cams that actuate the third valves have a .060 to .080 clearance from cam face to valve tappet face. Fun, fun, fun. So what I do is get a set of feeler gauges here. Let's see, .032, 035 is .067. We'll just use that. That looks good. I'll pull the lever so you can see. Gas mode, valves open. Diesel mode, valves closed. Then comes the valve cover gasket and the valve cover. I only put sealant on one side of the valve cover gasket so I can take the cover off easily, yet hold the gasket in place on the bottom side. Can't forget the wiring harness that goes over this. The spark plugs are easier to put in before the intake manifold goes in. And now the intake manifold. Everything's got to line up back here. This little thingy here's got to engage with this flapper here to close these flaps, and then this has got to go on the float lock on the carburetor. So we got to get everything lined up. There we go. And I can hook up all the linkages on the carburetor, the choke, the fuel, the overflow. Getting around back in here is always kind of difficult. But this being the 10th time that I've done it, might be a little bit easier. Or not. And the overflow pipe that goes on the carburetor. And the fuel line. Gasoline. Next are the plug wires, and you have to remember this rotates counterclockwise, opposite from a normal Farmall distributor. So we start with number 1 right here, goes to number 1. And then we go the other way to number 3, which is right there. And then to number 4, which is over here. And then finally to number 2. Get that back through there. Next come the gauges. Maybe. And the air cleaner. everything so difficult? Regular M isn't this difficult. I don't like you very much. Break down again, I just might not fix you. Before I tighten up that air cleaner, I want to make sure that my inlet pipe here is on so I know where to set the air cleaner in. That's got to turn. It's got to come up. There we go. Got the air cleaner connections all hooked up. This ventilation line, the line that comes from the injection pump, the air cleaner for that. Now we're going to put on the diesel throttle linkage. And this goes in here, and that's all there is to it. That's all there is to mechanics to begin with. Just put this thing in this thing, make sure they fit right, make sure it's clean, and away you go. Now we'll fill it up with antifreeze and then we can do a little test start. And I'm going to let it get good and warm running here, shut it down, and then retorque the head bolt. I didn't hook up the steering yet because it's a lot easier to pull the valve cover and do the head bolt without the rod going over top. She idles awful nice. I'm going to let it cool down, go in and have some lunch, and then retorque the cylinder head. Alright, lunch is over. I got to take this back apart, retorque things. Everything appears fine up here. The top end was getting plenty of oil. Nothing broken. That would have been a kick in the head. This has got to come back off. Alright, I got all that stuff off. Now we'll torque them down once again to 120. How'd you get reversed? You're not reversed. She took some. She took a little. She took a little. All of them took a little bit. All the cylinder head nuts did. Just about maybe a 1/16 of a turn. And now we're all set to put everything back together here. If I can find the nuts, where did they go? Ah, here they are. Now we'll make it drivable. Slide the steering shaft in. Everything looks good under here. I don't see any leaks on either side. But I think what I'll do is, after I work it for 6 hours, 4 hours a day, something like that, I'll go back through and retorque the head nuts again, just to make sure, just to have them triple, quadruple, quintuple checked. The MD runs nice. Of course, it ran nice before until it didn't. Well, we'll see. We can just hope for the best. I got to pull it back into the shop and touch up the paint on the head and touch up the other paint and adjust the brakes. These restoration projects seem to be a never-ending to-do list for years on end until you get them just right, or maybe you never get them just right. Anyway, I look forward to having this back out in the field working whenever that is. If the rain picks up, maybe we'll be working on hay with it later in the season. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's nice having her back in action. I'll see you next time.